legendary director and actor Rob Reiner and his wife Michelle Singer-Reiner have been found dead in their LA home.
A family member is now being questioned in connection with their deaths.
Hidden beneath Rob Reiner's Brentwood mansion was something that made the FBI freeze the moment they saw it. These were investigators who had seen everything: crime scenes, cartels, human trafficking networks. But this was different. This was built with purpose, hidden perfectly. And somehow, it had been sitting there for years beneath one of Hollywood's most visible homes.
Time for questions, but because of this is a preliminary investigation still, very active.
When they began digging through what was inside, they realized something that would completely change how Rob and his wife truly died. The brutal discovery of death in Brentwood. On December 14, 2025, a call went out that immediately froze everyone who heard it. Rob Reiner and his wife, Michelle Singer-Reiner, were reported dead inside their Brentwood mansion. That morning had been ordinary. Coffee, a phone call, the kind of day that gives no warning. When investigators arrived, they were not met with chaos or panic, but with silence. The house was intact, calm, and almost respectful. That calm was the first thing that felt wrong. Not the silence of an empty house, the silence of a house that had already decided something. Both bodies were found in the master bedroom. According to early investigative summaries, the injuries were fatal and deliberate. This was not an accident, and it did not resemble a sudden outburst of rage. Officers on scene said the wounds showed precision. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing and when to stop. They knew when enough was enough. That distinction mattered to investigators more than almost anything else. There was no sign of hesitation, and that detail alone shifted the tone of the case from tragedy to something far darker. The discovery was made by their daughter, Romy Reiner. She entered the house expecting a routine visit. The front door was unlocked. She called out. Nobody answered. What she saw instead caused her to run back out screaming. She did not call 911 herself. She left the front door open behind her. She fled the property in shock. It was her roommate who lived nearby that placed the emergency call at 3:38 p.m. after Romy arrived in visible distress. By that point, Romy could not speak clearly enough to give an address. By the time first responders arrived, the house was already sealed in dread. Inside the bedroom, investigators noted something deeply unsettling. There were no broken objects, no overturned furniture, and no smashed frames or signs of a violent struggle spilling through the room. The bedside lamp was still on. A glass of water sat on the nightstand, undisturbed. Yet the forensic evidence clearly showed this was a homicide. The contrast disturbed seasoned officers. Violence had occurred, but it had been contained and almost managed. One officer later described it as the most controlled crime scene he had ever walked into. There was no forced entry anywhere in the home. The doors were locked or undisturbed, and the windows were intact. Nothing of value was missing, as jewelry, electronics, and personal items were exactly where they should be. This was not a robbery gone wrong, and investigators quickly ruled that out. That left only two possibilities. It was either someone the couple trusted had been inside, or someone had access to the house long before that day. Both possibilities pointed in the same direction, toward someone who didn't need to force a door because they already had one. As crime scene technicians worked, they began noticing small details that contradicted the stillness. There were light disturbances in the carpet fibers and objects that were subtly out of alignment. These were not signs of a struggle, but signs of effort to reduce visible damage and to keep the scene clean. Whoever was responsible had not fled in panic. They had tidied up. That single detail changed the temperature of the entire investigation. At this point, investigators believed they were dealing with a contained domestic tragedy. As the search widened beyond the bedroom and into the structure of the mansion itself, agents began finding things that were never disclosed, never documented, and never meant to be seen. What was hidden beneath the house would soon eclipse the horror of the bodies above it. The hidden world of secret tunnels and passages. As the initial shock of the crime scene settled, Los Angeles police made the decision to bring in federal assistance, not because of publicity or status, but because the house itself was starting to raise questions that local investigators could not answer alone. During a secondary sweep of the Brentwood mansion, agents reportedly noticed inconsistencies between the layout of the home and the original architectural records. Measurements did not line up. Walls seemed thicker than they should have been, and floor plans ended where physical space continued, hinting at something hidden in plain sight. What began as a routine verification quietly turned into something else entirely. Behind a concealed panel near a storage area, FBI investigators uncovered the first access point, leading into a space that defied all rational expectations. It led downward into a narrow passage that did not exist on any city permit, renovation record, or inspection report tied to the property. As agents moved deeper, they discovered that the passage was not isolated. It connected to a network of tunnels and small chambers running beneath the house. These secret tunnels branched in multiple directions and disappeared under sections of the property that should have had no hollow space at all. According to sources close to the investigation, even veteran agents were surprised by the scale and concealment of what they were seeing. This was an entire concealed world within the 5,245 square foot home. Some sections of the tunnels appeared old, with rough concrete and aging support beams that suggested they may have been built decades earlier, possibly during the Prohibition era when hidden passages were not uncommon in wealthy Los Angeles homes. But other sections looked disturbingly recent. Investigators reported modern lighting rigs bolted into the ceilings, active ventilation systems, and power cables that had been installed with care. These were not abandoned spaces but maintained, supplied, and intentionally kept usable. Inside several chambers, agents found signs that someone had been spending extended periods underground. Shelving units held bottled water, packaged food, and cleaning supplies. Backpacks sat against walls, some partially unzipped, containing clothing and personal items. Shoes were placed neatly near sleeping areas rather than discarded, suggesting routine use rather than emergency hiding. The air carried a faint mix of dampness and chemical cleaners, indicating the space had been scrubbed and aired out recently, not left untouched. What troubled investigators most was the organization. Items were not scattered randomly, but were arranged. Notes were reportedly found in some areas, written on loose paper and notebook pages, filled with fragmented thoughts, schedules, and observations that made little sense on their own. While officials have been careful not to describe the contents in detail, sources indicated the writing suggested fixation and instability rather than planning for construction or maintenance. This was not the workspace of a contractor. It appeared to belong to someone watching, waiting, and documenting. As word of the tunnels spread quietly through investigative channels, neighbors were re-interviewed. According to reports, several mentioned unusual deliveries over the years, including late-night drop-offs and construction materials that never resulted in visible renovations. Others recalled hearing sounds beneath the house at odd hours, but dismissed them as plumbing or routine maintenance. At the time, nothing seemed alarming. In hindsight, those small details began to form a pattern that no one had recognized while it was happening. Further examination suggested that some tunnel sections had been modified gradually, layered on top of older structures rather than built all at once. This raised disturbing questions about how long the space had been in use and whether more than one person had access to it. Investigators reportedly began considering whether the tunnels were used not just for movement, but for observation. The positioning of certain chambers aligned closely with key areas of the house above, suggesting that someone below could track movement, routines, and habits without ever being seen. By this point, the investigation had shifted. The mansion was no longer just a crime scene but an environment where someone may have studied the family for weeks or months, learning when doors opened, when lights went out, and when people were alone. The evidence increasingly suggested that whoever used these tunnels did not need to force their way into the house. They already knew it. And as agents continued mapping the underground network, one realization began to settle in. The person most capable of moving through these passages unnoticed would not be an outsider. It would have to be someone who belonged there, someone who knew the house well enough to vanish inside it, and someone whose connection to the family would soon become impossible to ignore. Nick Reiner, the son in the shadows. It did not take very long for Nick Reiner's name to surface, because no matter which direction the evidence pointed, it kept looping back to him. He had been staying in the guest house on the property the night it happened, and when authorities began looking into his story, they discovered something unsettling. By 32, Nick Reiner had been in and out of rehab 18 times. His first stay was at 15 years old. Over the years that followed, he worked his way through heroin, meth, and cocaine, and there were periods where he ended up homeless on the streets of Maine, New Jersey, and Texas. Not because his family cut him off. Every time a program came with rules he didn't want to follow, he walked out and took his chances outside instead. The streets were hard, but to Nick, they were still preferable to being told what to do. Detectives reviewing the family history described him as someone who moved in and out of control. He could be calm for long stretches and then become suddenly erratic, which made every recent interaction with his parents feel riskier in hindsight. The people who knew him best said the hardest part was never knowing which version of Nick was going to walk through the door. Friends of the family told detectives that growing up as Rob Reiner's son meant living inside a permanent comparison Nick never asked for and never escaped. Here is what that actually looked like. Rob loved baseball. Nick's brother Jake loved baseball too. So Rob and Jake had something. A language, a ritual, a reason to sit together and just exist without effort. Nick liked basketball. Rob didn't. And nobody ever closed that gap. Nick said it himself in a 2016 interview quietly, almost as an aside. "We didn't bond a lot as a kid. He really liked baseball, I liked basketball, and he could watch that with my brother." He wasn't angry when he said it. That was almost worse. It had the tone of something accepted long ago. A boy who had simply made peace with being the one his father didn't quite reach. While his father's success opened doors, it also shut others, as Nick's attempts at music and writing were quietly dismissed as indulgences rather than work, feeding a resentment that hardened over time. That resentment never settled into clean hatred, which made it more volatile, because it existed alongside a deep hunger for approval that Nick rarely received in the way he needed. He didn't want his father's fame. He wanted his father's attention. There is a difference, and Nick knew exactly what it felt like when one substituted for the other. This emotional contradiction became a recurring theme as investigators listened to old voicemails, read text messages, and interviewed therapists who had worked with him. What they found was not a portrait of a monster. It was something harder to sit with than that. By his late teens, Nick's struggle with substances had escalated from experimentation to dependency, pushing the family closer to crisis with every relapse. His time in rehab became a blur, followed by periods of fragile calm that inevitably shattered with arguments. Police had responded to that Brentwood address 7 times over 12 years. Welfare checks, mental health calls, none of it ever made the news. Police reports from wellness checks described an agitated young man who was convinced he was being controlled rather than helped, while Rob always appeared exhausted and rigid, holding firm to structure as the family's only anchor. Michelle often acted as mediator, but her role became increasingly impossible as Nick's episodes grew more severe. Nick had punched walls and destroyed a television after being told to leave the guest house. That wasn't a rumor. It was documented. This forced the family to rely on private security and round-the-clock supervision that quietly reshaped the home into a controlled space. What had once been a family home had become, in many ways, a managed environment. And Nick felt every inch of it. In the last 2 years, Nick's relocation to the guest house marked a turning point that investigators viewed as more than a practical separation. The structure was technically part of the property.
Nick Reiner charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. He's coming back here to court for the 3rd time. The first time his attorney said that they needed more time. The second time, his attorney said he could no longer represent him.
Yet physically removed from the main residence, creating a situation where proximity and isolation existed at the same time. Close enough to monitor, far enough to forget about. Investigators later learned that people close to the family had warned Rob and Michelle not to allow Nick back onto the property at all. They ignored it, whether out of love, guilt, or the particular blindness that only parents understand. They kept the door open. Neighbors recalled lights on at odd hours and figures moving between buildings late at night. These were details that meant little then, but took on new weight once detectives considered how someone could observe the household without being noticed. The arrangement raised a question that lingered over every interview. Who was watching whom, and for how long? Nobody had a clean answer, and that silence, in hindsight, said everything. Complicating everything was the semi-autobiographical film Nick and Rob had worked on together, titled Being Charlie. It was meant to heal old wounds by turning pain into art. Rob called it therapeutic. Nick called it the first time he ever really felt close to his father. Instead, it forced conversations neither man knew how to finish, exposing grievances that had been managed through silence rather than resolved. They sat across from each other in writing sessions and pulled apart the worst years of their relationship, scene by scene. Rob later admitted they got into fights during the process. At times it was really rough, he said, but they pushed through it because the film demanded honesty, and honesty had a cost. What investigators noted was that by the end of those sessions, Nick had something few people ever get: a detailed, intimate map of his parents' fears, failures, habits, and vulnerabilities. He didn't just know the house, he knew them, in ways that even their closest friends didn't. What he did with that knowledge was exactly what the investigation was now trying to determine. As detectives aligned timelines from the night of the murders, this history stopped feeling like background. It started feeling like a blueprint, not because it proved intent, but because it showed how familiarity could become dangerous when combined with resentment, access, and years of unresolved pain. The reconstruction suggested movement across the property that made sense only if someone knew exactly where to go without being seen. Not someone breaking in, someone coming back. And that realization pulled attention away from the bedroom and toward what lay beneath the house, where the family's private fractures and the physical layout of the estate converged in ways nobody outside that investigation was supposed to ever know about. The night before. Confrontation and madness. The night before the murders began in a room full of light, music, and cameras, the kind of setting where everything is meant to look controlled and celebratory. Yet several witnesses later said something felt off almost as soon as the Reiners arrived. Nick was with them, moving through the crowd in a way that drew attention without effort. His posture was tense, and his focus was fixed on whoever happened to be nearest. People recalled how conversations stalled when he joined them, how his questions landed too sharply, circling around fame, loyalty, and whether anyone ever really knew the people they admired. This left guests unsure whether they were being challenged or tested. As the evening wore on, those questions turned more pointed and increasingly personal, with witnesses describing Nick pressing strangers for opinions about his father's work and his family, then shifting abruptly to confront Rob and Michelle in full view of the room. Voices were raised, then lowered, then raised again, creating a pattern that made others step back rather than intervene, because the anger seemed too contained to interrupt, yet too intense to ignore. When the family left early, the exit did not feel like a decision made together, but like the end of something unfinished. The tension carried out of the room rather than resolved inside it. Several attendees later told investigators that Nick's behavior lingered in their minds long after the party ended. Not because it was loud, but because it was focused, as if he were locked onto an argument he had been having internally for far longer than anyone realized. One guest reportedly recalled seeing him pacing outside while his parents waited by the car, his phone pressed to his ear and his expression tight and distant, raising questions about who he was speaking to and what had already been set in motion before they returned home. Once back at the mansion, the timeline becomes less clear. And that uncertainty is where investigators began to feel the shape of something deliberate. Digital records reportedly showed bursts of activity on Nick's devices followed by long gaps, periods where calls stopped and location data went silent. These were gaps that coincided closely with later findings inside the hidden tunnel system. Those absences did not suggest sleep or distraction, but movement through places where signals faded and surveillance could be avoided. Inside the house, forensic teams later identified subtle signs that an argument had continued, not loudly enough to alert neighbors, but forcefully enough to leave traces in how objects were shifted and pathways disturbed, but with someone navigating familiar routes. Investigators noted how certain sounds reported by neighbors, such as doors opening and lights flicking on and off, matched access points leading into the tunnels rather than common living spaces. Phone records deepened the unease, showing that Nick's devices had been used not only to communicate, but possibly to monitor, suggesting awareness of who was where and when. This behavior reframed the confrontation from an emotional outburst into something colder. Detectives began to question whether the argument was the breaking point or merely the surface event masking something already unfolding beneath the house. By the time investigators aligned these details with the physical evidence, the focus shifted decisively downward, away from the party and the argument, and toward the hidden spaces that connected them. Every unanswered question from that night seemed to lead back to the tunnels, to movements unseen, to decisions made out of sight, and to evidence waiting in the one place that no guest, no neighbor, and no camera was ever meant to see. The tunnel revelation of surveillance and obsession. The first indication that the tunnels had a role in the murders came when agents moved past the stored clothing and supplies and realized the layout was not random, but organized with intention. And when read, they shifted between personal grievances, timelines, and crude diagrams of the house above. The writing jumped from careful planning to emotional outbursts without warning, referencing family arguments, perceived betrayals, and moments pulled from private conversations that should never have been overheard. Agents noted that the level of detail implied direct observation, not memory, raising the question of how anyone could know so much about daily life inside rooms that were supposed to be secure. That question was answered moments later when a technician followed a cable run into a narrow side chamber and uncovered a cluster of hidden electronics sealed behind false panels. Inside were multiple burner phones labeled and powered off, along with USB drives wrapped in cloth and marked with dates. This was not careless storage, but deliberate concealment, suggesting someone who understood the risk of discovery and took steps to protect their data. This confirmed that whatever had been happening in these tunnels was meant to stay hidden at all costs. When the agents traced the cables further, the mood shifted sharply because the wires did not end in dead space, but led to something that made the agents turn pale. The cables fed into a network of small, professionally installed cameras positioned with disturbing precision. As the feds turned on the screens one by one, they saw live and recorded feeds of the house above, including entrances, hallways, and areas that no outsider should have been able to see. Then one feed resolved into a clear view of a bedroom, and another into the master suite, Rob and Michelle's bedroom. One agent stepped back, another said nothing. The room went completely silent. These were people who processed crime scenes for a living, who had learned to separate what they saw from what they felt. But there was no procedure for this. No training that prepared you for watching a dead woman's bedroom play back on a screen hidden beneath her own floor. Someone had been watching them sleep, watching them live, and they never knew. This confirmed that private spaces had been monitored continuously without the occupants' knowledge. Agents later described the moment they understood the scope of the surveillance as physically unsettling, because the camera angles were adjusted to capture faces, habits, and routines rather than just movement. The system allowed someone below the house to watch lights turn off, doors close, and bodies move through rooms in real time, creating a one-sided intimacy that felt less like security and more like control. The fact that the setup focused so heavily on bedrooms suggested obsession, not curiosity, and raised the chilling possibility that the victim's final hours had been observed minute by minute. Further inspection revealed ventilation units and low-level lighting designed to keep the tunnels livable without drawing attention, along with evidence that the cameras had been checked and adjusted recently. This was not an abandoned system left behind by a previous owner, but an active operation maintained and used, allowing someone to remain underground for extended periods while monitoring the emotional and physical state of the people above. Investigators began to consider whether the surveillance had been used not just to plan movements, but to exert psychological pressure, creating an environment where the victims might have sensed something was wrong without knowing why. By the time forensic teams reconstructed the timeline using footage and device logs, it became clear that the house had been watched as a controlled space, with actions tracked, patterns learned, and moments chosen. The tunnels were no longer viewed as a background detail, but as the center of the case. This transformed the deaths from a tragic family collapse into something far more deliberate, where fear, observation, and control played a central role. What began as a domestic investigation now pointed toward calculated terror, forcing investigators to confront not only how the crime was carried out, but who would go to such lengths to watch before acting. The unanswered questions. By the time the tunnel evidence was cataloged and sealed, investigators understood that the case had crossed a line from a private family tragedy into something far more disturbing. The tunnels were now treated as the spine of the investigation, raising the unsettling question of who knew how to use them, who had access over time, and who understood the house well enough to move through it without being seen or heard. As analysts reviewed surveillance data and physical evidence, attention increasingly returned to Nick, not because of a single incriminating detail, but because of how many pieces seemed to align around him. He had lived on the property, moved between structures, and spent years in conflict with his parents, creating a scenario where access and motive overlapped in ways that could not be ignored. While no conclusion had been reached, no one else fit the narrow profile suggested by the tunnels and the surveillance system better than Nick Reiner. Records showed Nick had the technical familiarity and the physical proximity to understand how such a system could be installed and maintained without outside contractors raising alarms. The presence of cameras in his own room complicated the picture, suggesting either a deeply disturbed act of self-surveillance or an attempt to document interactions and conflicts, blurring the line between victim and observer in a way that unsettled even experienced agents. The question remained whether this pointed to guilt, paranoia, or something far more complex. At the same time, another possibility troubled investigators, because the tunnels themselves may not have been Nick's creation at all. Some evidence suggested parts of the system were older, raising speculation that Rob himself may have originally authorized or constructed certain hidden features years earlier. This could have possibly been a misguided attempt to monitor his son's struggles or protect the household from Nick's unpredictable behavior. If true, it created a chilling scenario where a tool meant for control or safety was later repurposed and used to take his own life. This uncertainty left the case suspended in a narrow space between explanation and accusation, where no theory fully resolved the contradictions. Wealth, fame, and privacy had combined to create an environment where troubling behavior could exist without scrutiny, allowing obsessions to grow unnoticed beneath a public image of success and stability. Investigators described the situation as deeply unsettling because the resources meant to ensure comfort and protection may have enabled secrecy on a scale rarely seen. Outside the investigation, tributes and memorials focused on Rob Reiner's cultural impact and public life, while little was said about the darker elements uncovered inside the mansion. The contrast between public mourning and private horror created an uneasy silence, as if acknowledging the tunnels and surveillance would force people to confront how easily intimacy can be violated behind closed doors. Even discussions of the estate and inheritance were handled cautiously, as speculation about financial motives remained unproven and deeply sensitive. As the case remains open, officials continue to avoid definitive statements, emphasizing that evidence must be interpreted carefully and legally. Yet the unanswered questions linger, centered on access, intent, and the hidden escalation of obsession beneath a famous home. The mansion now stands sealed and watched, with its underground passages mapped but not fully understood, leaving behind a disturbing reminder that even the most familiar faces can exist above spaces no one ever imagined, where answers may never fully come to light. Make sure to click the cards on the screen now for more interesting videos.